We are actually moving out of the IDs itself. We are not touching as much the code. We are just guiding it. And that's meant in the sense that they're a family. Yes. That the word gent is cognate with that. Yes. And he actually, the term Anglo-Saxon wasn't really used yet. English was the first. The term English is used before Anglo-Saxon is ever used. Yeah. And in fact, Bede uses the term English to refer to the migrants retroactively in the 5th century. So he's writing in the 700s, but he's saying, the people in the 400s were English. And he doesn't just apply the word English to the Angles, but to the Saxons as well, which is interesting because I wonder how distinct they were. It's also interesting that the Scots the only people of the Anglo-Saxons, the ones who lived adjacent to the Scots, were the Angles. Yes. And the Scottish word for them is Sassenach, Saxon. Okay. Yeah. So the Scots refer to the Angles as Saxons, and Bede referred to the Saxons as Angles. Yes. And indeed, the southernmost part of the island was populated by Saxons, and the French referred to them as Anglais. So it's, okay. So I mean, how distinct were they? Yeah. So I think they were. I think there was a lot of. I think they were very quickly seen as one people, and the fact that they migrated at the same time is very telling. It wasn't just random, like, some Germanic people turned up. They must have communicated and arranged this entire thing, and this is a complicated process. To depopulate an entire region, it doesn't happen regularly. And it would be, even now, with modern technologies, it would be an extraordinarily difficult thing to arrange, to depopulate an entire country. So you can't imagine that something like this occurred randomly or like sporadically. It's still a mystery because they didn't write anything down about why they did it. We only have the people complaining about it, the Britons complaining about it.
The far right of the time.
Yeah. Well, why did they object? They were doing the jobs that they didn't want to be.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay, so, but I suppose, at what point would you date a sense of what we might call English nationhood, a sense of English nationhood maturing?
Well, I would say that, at the very least, you'd say Bede invented it.
Right.
That would mean it was the 700s. And then that later Alfred began the process of turning that into a political reality.
Yes.
But I personally don't believe Bede invented it. Okay. I don't think he was this political mastermind saying, I'm going to invent a people who don't actually exist, but I'm going to bring them into being with my propaganda. I don't think that's what it was. I do think to some extent it was a work of propaganda, but the issue for him was ecclesiastical.
Right.
The problem being that the initial distinction between the English and the Britons was that the Britons were Christian and the English worshipped Woden and the other gods. But by Bede's time, that was no longer the case. And the English had actually adopted Christianity, partly from the Gaelic missionaries in the north, the Columban mission, but also partly from a direct mission from the south, the Gregorian mission. And ultimately, we became more orthodox to Roman Catholic customs, than the previous inhabitants who had a divergent calculation for Easter, the date of Easter. And that calculation of Easter seems to be the only significant difference of the types of Christianity. Some people talk about Celtic Christianity. I'm not among the people who believe that existed. I think they just had a slightly different Easter calculation. Right. But that was still an issue of some controversy among Christians at the time. And I think that the work was basically trying to iron out that the English are a Christian people, but we're not the same as these other Christian people who have a funny way of doing Easter. And part of the way that he distinguishes them is by saying we have heathen origins and we came as a heathen people and we were different from you. So he's saying that they're different ethnically, but I can't imagine he was I can't imagine that opinion didn't exist previously.
Right.
I'm sure that was already there.
Yes.
But I mean,
he was giving it renewed salience in a religious context.
Yeah, he was just packaging it in a way that justified the English in the eyes of decent European Christians.
Right. I see.
Yeah.
So obviously, again, this is St. George's Day. At what point does St. George become the patron saint of England, and what is your response to the landmark finding pushed by people like James Felton and James O'Brien that St. George was in fact a Palestinian that looked like Yasser Arafat?
That's the first time I've heard that. No, I can't believe you're saying he didn't eat bacon and eggs and he wasn't from England.
This is what James Felton tells me in 53 Times Britain Was a Bell End. Landmark work on the matter.
Oh my goodness. Well, initially, of course, the patron saint of England was King Edmund, Saint Edmund, who was martyred in a suspiciously similar way to Saint Sebastian. In fact, the hagiography even says he was just like Sebastian when he was killed. So I'm not sure how reliable the hagiography is, and also
it's a bit on the nose, that, isn't it?
Yeah, well, he gets killed by Vikings. They shoot loads of arrows into him until he resembles a hedgehog, and then after they cut off his head, it carries on talking, which is evidence of his sainthood.
Right.
And a wolf guards it, which is quite a cool story, isn't it?
I'm Anne Middleton. I've been feeling increasingly let down by my government and how they manage my money.
And a wolf guards it, which is quite a cool story, isn't it? Apparently not cool enough, because later on we decided to switch him out for the very popular perennial saint that in many places like St. George. And it was relating to a battle with the French where allegedly...
when did this happen? Was this the 15th century?
Oh, yeah, this is long after my period of expertise.
Okay, right.
I can't remember.
In the late medieval period?
Yeah, in the High Middle Ages.
High Middle Ages.
And when we were having one of our many
quarrels with the French.
And apparently St. George appeared in the sky and assisted us in our beating them. So basically, he helped us kill foreigners, which is why we love him to this day. But St. George is a very interesting saint because in more than one location, he was worshipped by pagans, not in England, but in the Baltic, where they did remain pagan into the 1500s. They worshipped Saint George among the gods, and in the Caucasus Mountains, a similar thing occurred, where a native god was conflated with St. George, and there are still is to this day. This is because all across Europe, going back to those Indo-Europeans, we can reliably reconstruct one of the oldest myths in the world involves a very strong man who kills a dragon or a large reptilian foe. Well, the word dragon is nebulous. I mean, even in Old English, the word for dragon was worm, which is the same word that we use for snake. Right. And of course, now we keep it to refer to spineless invertebrates, leadless spineless invertebrates. But this myth is very old, and of course, it existed in an English form. It would have been the dragon slayer Sigurd, this one who's given to Sigurd, the whole Volsunga saga, which became Wagner's opera. This story is another perennial story of the Germanic people, so the English had it too. So it would have been, even before we made St. George our saint, back in the Anglo-Saxon times, the figure of the dragon slayer was a well-known and well-celebrated one. It's in Beowulf as a dragon slayer. Beowulf himself is a dragon slayer. There's a dragon Fafnir as well. And it's no accident that Lord of the Rings, Tolkien's attempt at making mythology for the English includes an Hobbit, rather. Smaug, yeah. That's deliberate. He knows. He was professor of Anglo-Saxon studies at Oxford. He knew very well what he was doing. He wanted to preserve this thing. So in all parts of Europe, the perennial popularity of St. George is due to a much older underlying love of the dragon slaying myth.
But nevertheless, there's a sense that we feel threatened at the moment. And I suppose that one thing that I did want to ask you is that a lot of English people, or self-described English nationalists, and I say that deliberately as opposed to British nationalists, are of the view that we have been, the very concept of Britain is sort of disastrously broad and inclusive by nature. Now, I should say that for my own part, that I think that we are stronger as a union of peoples, and that talk of English independence is a distraction at best, though I do understand why people feel that way and would would not want to demonise them for thinking that England needs to detach itself from the concept of Britain. Where do you stand on British unionism versus English independence?
I'm 100% with the Union.
Yes.
My Scottish ancestors were British patriots. They wanted the Union. I have records. They had one of my Scottish ancestors in Edinburgh ran a pie shop covered in Union Jacks and pictures of the King. I have ancestors from Ireland. They were all, it was British then. They were all pro-British. This like anti-Britishness, I think, is sometimes is obviously funded by our enemies. It has been, yes, definitely. I think Gaddafi was funding. So I have to say that again because I touched the microphone. I think Gaddafi was funding some separatist groups in the British Isles. So that's been documented. But anything, this is like an 800-mile long island or something. Like, what? In this day and age, it just seems quite absurd. Like when people talk about, like the separatist groups. Also, I remember recently there was a very suspicious political party called for Northumbrian Independence, and it was using the language of nativism and localism, but it was always counter-signaling any patriotic activity, and then it was revealed that the guy behind it was a Labour part of the Labour Party. The whole thing had been a ploy to split the I think it was at the time the UKIP vote in the northeast, take it away. They were worried about working class English people voting for UKIP, so they're like, if we give them a local party, they can appeal to their local identity, then they're all destroyed. So yes, you should be very suspicious of any of these calls for the breakup of the Union. I think they don't make sense economically. Obviously, everyone is justified in wanting to protect the uniqueness of their culture. The Scots have a unique culture. It shouldn't be homogenized and blended into some grey
hybrid.
Yeah, that's not what I'm supporting. The Union, which they voluntarily entered into,
did quite well out of it.
Yeah, they're our brothers. Yeah. They helped us with the British Empire. We wouldn't have been able to do it without them. So that's what I like about Scotland. It's like it's part of we're the same people in the sense for the last 200 years or so. We've been fighting together, and the idea of like this Mel Gibson fake history where they're just poor little Ewoks who've been killed, who've been suppressed, is like ridiculous. And it won't help them at all. It won't help them. It won't help Scotland to be strong. It won't help Wales to be strong. It won't help them. Right now we have to present a united front, and all of us together as British.
I could not possibly agree with you more. Now, one thing I can hear our adversaries, Tom, saying throughout the course of this discussion is that we're talking about an awful lot of demographic mixing that's gone on over the centuries here, and this is kind of sort of the last refuge that our opponents will. This is the last refuge of our scoundrel opponents, I suppose, is that they will say things like, well, what this goes to show is that we are all human beings and all fundamentally interchangeable in the grand scheme of things. I'm actually going to quote one of them, the mainstream historian Stephen Oppenheimer, who in his book The Origins of the British says this: Celts, Angles, Utes, Saxons, Vikings, Normans and others are all minorities compared with the first unnamed pioneers who around 15,000 years ago ventured into the empty, chilling lands so recently vacated by the great ice sheets. What are your thoughts on that kind of argument?
Born before 1980 with no life insurance may be eligible for this. If you meet these two requirements, you could be eligible for up to £300,000 in life cover to help cover stuff like your funeral costs, debts, mortgages, and even relieve the financial burden on your family when you pass away. If you live in the UK and are over the age of 45, then you may be eligible for up to £300,000 in life cover. But here's the real surprise. No medical exams are needed for approval. See how much you could save if you're eligible. And the great news is you can find out if you're eligible quickly and for free by following these two simple steps. Click the Learn More button below now and answer a few questions and find out if you qualify. Click the Learn More button now. There's no obligation, no pressure, just clear, honest information. All you need to do is answer a few simple questions to see if you qualify. Click the Learn More button now.
If
if you want to make a full-time income from home working part-time, you need to know this one concept, because there is a new and better way to make money in UK real estate without ever buying houses and being a landlord. You never get any loans. You don't need to buy, fix up, and renovate homes like you see on TV shows like Homes Under the Hammer. That can be risky. And you never put money down, you never get credit checked, and you don't need any prior experience or qualifications in order to start doing this on the side. In fact, you could run this from your kitchen on the evenings and weekends, or you could take your laptop and run it from a coffee shop like I do, if you like, because you never visit any of these houses to flip them. And it's a simple formula. To give an example of one of my students, Ed. Ed lives in Italy, Rome, and he flips houses for £3,000 to £5,000 per flip in the northeast of England. And he never puts his own money down, and he never gets any loans, so he doesn't need any credit checks. All he uses is a laptop and an internet connection. And it's not just him. I've been teaching for a decade now, over the last 10 years, and here's some of my top students. We've rented mansions in Spain, and I've taught this for a long time. And we've been flipping houses remotely for the last decade, quietly just getting on and doing it. And one of my top students, Gavin, he was struggling in the golf industry. He was about to be fired in his job. He was making roughly about £3,000 a month. And he stumbled across this opportunity. He acted on it, and it's completely changed his life. Listen to what Gavin had to say.
And I know what you're all going to be thinking, like I did. I don't know if this is going to work. Should I do it? I'm telling you now, just go for it. Go for it, don't look back. Study, if you do what they say, it will work. I've got 4 in escrow going through this month.
Flipping houses online, where you just need a laptop and an internet connection to begin this. And you don't need money down, you don't need any credit checks or loans, and you don't need any starter qualifications or degrees or experience in order to start flipping your first deal. So in fact, my challenge for you is to flip your first deal in the next 30 days, like hundreds of my students have. So let me show you. This is an ad. I have limited amount of time. So what I want you to do is follow the blue arrows, whether you're on mobile or desktop. Click those links. It's going to take you to a very simple page. You're going to put your details in. It's completely secure, and you're going to get registered for a time this week. We'll be hosting a couple of trainings where you can register and you can get started. You can discover how this model works. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you my best-selling book as a bonus for doing that. It's called How to Flip Properties with No Money, Credit, or Experience. It's been purchased over 30,000 times and counting. I'm going to give you this completely for free instantly.
Well, it's a lie, and it's disingenuous with the form of argumentation, but it's also technically incorrect as well. The idea that the ice sheets, where we have no evidence, very little evidence of human habitation, didn't have people on is wrong. It's we get a lot of evidence for Paleolithic activity in Europe, in the south of France and northern Spain, because there are cave systems there which were not covered in ice, but people hunted animals wherever they went. That's what they did, and people crossed the Bering Straits on ice sheets like 25,000 years ago or something. I don't know exactly when, from to Alaska. You really think there was no one hunting on Britain before 15,000 years ago? Of course there were. Of course, in fact, there were probably Neanderthals hunting there before human beings even. And recently there's evidence that the oldest evidence of human-made fire is now found in Britain as well. So a Paleolithic date, I think. But
in terms of the form of argumentation, then
that's disingenuous as well, because the people those Mesolithic people, all of the other groups that they mentioned descend from that Mesolithic population.
Right.
So if you think that the Cheddar Men people are the rightful inhabitants, well, we are. That's us, not anyone else. Yeah. There's no Western hunter-gatherer ancestry in Africa. There's no Western hunter-gatherer ancestry in the Near East. There's only in Europe, and the highest amount in Europe are in Northern Europe. So the further south you go in Europe, the less of it is. I think Greece has the least. But yeah, so it's a problem with understanding the chronology. Like the each subsequent people is formed of those that came before.
Of course, yes.
So Western hunter-gatherers exist only through modern European people.
Yes, and so what is being described there, he makes it sound as if a melting pot of sorts has kind of long been raging in these islands. But what we're really talking about is a very orderly and undisturbed blend of close-knit elements.
Yeah, interspersed with terrible events of conflict between these people competing for resources.
Yes.
So people they never welcomed the newcomers who they competed for resources.
Yes.
And naturally, why should they?
Yes. And so in other words, we do have cause to care about the extent to which we are threatened today.
It's perfectly natural, not only human, but literally every biological organism has that inbuilt. It's, that's life, it's competition for resources, that's how it works.
Yes. Now, you are a pagan, of course, but England, as you said earlier, has been a Christian nation for over a millennia now. I'm talking, not so much want to get into the theology here, Tom, but more into the politics of the matter. Do you think that it is going to be difficult at all? Given that there is something of a resurgence of neo-paganism going on, I think you'd agree with that. You said that. You wrote a piece for Unheard once about how the future is pagan. Increasingly, there is this view.
I never said the future is pagan.
What did you say? That was their title.
I'm not unrealistic like that.
Okay.
I don't believe that the whole world's going to become pagan.
Okay.
Yeah.
But sorry for misrepresenting you there.
Some editors do things like that.
You're right, I should know this as someone who's written pieces before myself, although conspicuously not an Unheard. Anyhow, do you think that, I would say, then I'll speak for myself, I would say that there is a resurgence of neo-paganism going on. So it's not as sophisticated as the kind that you're interested in, which is much more sort of rooted in history. For most people, it is just a reflexive sense that Christianity has enfeebled the West and that we need to recommune with a sense of tribal identity because Christianity is too universal. Our software should not be running on this sort of desert alien religion. That's kind of the rough. We should recommune with our ancestral gods and all the rest of it. That tends to be the kind of the less detailed form of neo-paganism that is about today on the right. Do you think, despite the fact that there is this growing rift between English nationalists who are Christian, or English patriots who are Christian, and English patriots who are either atheist or have eccentric neo-pagan beliefs, do you think that we are nevertheless going to be able to present a united front in order to achieve demographic security this century and to rally around common symbols, common cultural symbols that testify to our shared status as Englishmen?
Yes, I do, because of the nature of English identity and what has happened since the Civil War. The Civil War was such a terrible event, so brutal, so disgraceful. We slaughtered so many of each other, and it basically, over the course of the 18th century, with some radical ideas I don't agree with emerged, but what I do agree with was that there was came about a kind of idea that we need to live with each other, and that's going to necessitate a certain tolerance of each other's religious differences. Now, this has subsequently been expanded to include very, very alien religions that were never initially intended to be included. But it was, I mean, even in the late 18th century, we were hanging Catholics in the streets of London. So this was a problem. I don't think that was a good thing. But what we reached by the 19th century was an extremely civilized culture where in the late 19th century that would be unthinkable. Catholics would be hanged in the streets of Victorian London would never happen. So that was an improvement, I believe.
Me too.
But and that's part of being English. That is what that is, and it's been exploited and say, oh, you have to tolerate literally any thing that comes along. What it meant is that you have to tolerate other English people, other English people and their religious differences, because there were some very peculiar small Protestant sects, and even some guy in one part of London declared himself Jesus, and a not insignificant number of his neighbours believed that he was, until they asked him to walk across the pond and he couldn't do it, and then I think they beat him up. But this kind of thing, there was a great deal of religious innovation in early modern Britain, and a lot of differences within the Isles, from the very lowest of the low church to all the way to Catholics, all having to coexist.
Yes.
Now, the main group it's not the atheists, it's no religion.
Yes.
And I think that's important because
That's true, yes.
when you do other, when you drill down and do surveys with people who say they have no religion and ask, do you believe in something like a god or something? They say yes.
Yeah.
But they don't identify as Christian or pagan or anything. They just don't know they don't even care to define it, but they're like, I don't know. But they have a general respect. And they're part of English culture. They don't really like to talk about religion so much. We don't have politicians like in America going on and on about their faith. It's not necessary, or not desirable, in fact, even among Christians, let alone this majority segment of our population who can call themselves no religion.
Yes.
Pagans like myself, or even the broadest possible sense of pagans, it's still numbers like as 250,000 maximum. So that's not insignificant, but not significant enough to dictate the future of the country or what the future of the of faith will look like in the British Isles.
And nor to preclude our presenting a united front.
No, not at all. I mean, what I would say is to Christian and pagan and any religious compatriots is that we need to remember that the actual religious character of England today is one of ambiguity and an understated sort of private nature of religion, and also an acceptance of religious difference. And that can sound a bit weak, especially when it so resembles the language the left uses to justify tolerance for what is intolerable, the atrocities that have occurred in this country by
people of foreign extraction.
Yes. Keep that in mind. That's one of the things that makes it an attractive place to be. Which is not to say that there can't be a resurgence in faith. I think that faith, in whatever form it takes, is generally good for people because it helps them to see life in its full depth and appreciate the wonder of being, rather than. And unfortunately, atheists tend to be quite depressed, I think, because they miss out on that part of the human experience. But yes, as far as politics goes, we can't have a religious right in the sense that that America can do, where people, which results in people who aren't even religious pretending to be, so because it's politically expedient. So we have to do something different. We have to keep it British
and retain our character in the process. Last of all, you've been in the game a while. On St George's Day 2026, are you optimistic about the future of England and the English people, and how has your sense of optimism or pessimism, as the case may be, changed in, let's say, the last 10 years?
Strangely, while pretty much every metric of the conditions of our life has gotten worse, the demographics are getting worse, crime is getting worse, culture is getting worse, everything's getting worse. People are becoming more sloppy, everything's messier, the country's terribly overpopulated, the rivers are overpolluted, there are scowling foreigners on every small market town now. But I feel much more optimistic than I did 10 years ago, because now there's a potential route to change, which I couldn't really see one before. I was of the opinion that one should fight for what's right, regardless of whether there was any chance of winning, because I thought that was the honourable thing to do. And so I believed in patriotic activism, even in the face of defeat. Just do it anyway, because how else can you live honourably? But now I think, with work that you and Rupert Lowe are doing, that's one potential avenue to a better future for our country. And I think generally the flagging phenomenon, and just generally speaking to people in rural Devon, there's a lot of sympathetic ears, and people are ready for something different, and they're ready for a renewal of the country. And I think they're ready to dispense with some of the 20th century superstitions, these platitudes that we constantly repeat that are obviously false now, things about diversity being a strength, when you can see so obviously that the NHS is overburdened by these people, the housing is too expensive, job market is disastrous for young people, general economy, purchasing power, energy is far too expensive. So many problems that, or many of which can be partially alleviated or entirely alleviated by deporting a lot of people. So hopefully that will occur.
Tom Russell, thank you.
Thank you.
Shake and win millions of prizes with the AliExpress $1 challenge. Get unreal deals for just $1. Win $10,000 in flight credits and a $3,000 AliExpress shopping spree. Download, shake, win.
As the sun rose over Ireland on the 1st of July 1690, residents of Drogheda were awoken by the clamour coming from just west of the town. The deposed King James II of England crossed the River Boyne during the night near Oldbridge and made camp. Here he would attempt to reclaim the throne from his son-in-law, King William III of England, known as William of Orange. As William's forces gradually came into view, their superior numbers and weapons, as well as greater experience, were on full display. But James held a strong, defensible position on the south bank. The encounter on this battlefield is one of those that are felt throughout Europe to this day. At stake were the British throne, French dominance on the continent, and religious power in Ireland. On the banks of the River Boyne, the next 4 hours will change the continent of Europe forever. The reign of King Charles II concluded on February 6, 1685, after a near quarter of a century. Though broadly successful in the aftermath of the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, the king had failed his subjects in one major respect, by not siring a legitimate heir. His successor was his controversial younger brother, James, who in just 3 years of rule had managed to make many an enemy throughout the kingdom. Through a series of actions, including his undermining of the law that prohibited Catholics from serving in public office, the new king had alienated many of his supporters who, fearing a repeat of the English Civil War unpleasantness, now began conspiring to remove him from power, balking at the prospect of a Catholic royal dynasty ruling the firmly Protestant England. However, James's kingship was not the only show in town. Before James's accession, King Charles II had arranged a Protestant match for his niece Mary over the objections of her father. Mary was wed to William, the Protestant Prince of Orange, whose ambition was nothing short of ruling the Kingdom of England. The Prince of Orange had a decent royal pedigree in his own right as a son of another Mary, James's sister, and was widely acknowledged as the premier Protestant champion on the continent. William certainly took his role very seriously as the counterweight to the most Catholic and absolute of monarchs, King Louis XIV. William had strived to build an anti-French alliance in the League of Augsburg. However, though impressive on paper, his main target for recruitment was England. A powerful navy, presenting an enticing prospect for combating their powerful enemy, France. For William, his marriage to the second in line to the throne may have soothed his own fears of a Catholic takeover in England. In his mind, James was not getting any younger, and without a male heir, his succession would be a brief, if unwelcome, aberration before the succession of his own wife. However, events in England threw William's fondly held hopes into doubt. On 10th of June 1688, Queen Mary birthed a healthy baby boy. This was the last straw. Fears heightened of an English slide back into Catholicism and absolutism. And, unfortunately for James, 7 prominent Protestants had already been in negotiations with William across the Channel. Worse, whispers circulated that the royal birth was in fact a fraud, the newborn smuggled into the Queen's chamber with a warming pan. Although this was untrue, if believed, such a rumor would have made any Catholic dynasty defunct before it even began. Unsurprisingly, William of Orange himself found it convenient to believe these nonsensical claims, given his own ambition. Readied for war, the Prince of Orange was held in port throughout late October by adverse winds. King James believed God protected him. However, God's protection was apparently lifted as William was able to sail out to sea on November the 1st, borne by a so-called Protestant wind. He sailed with his army through the English Channel and made landfall at Torbay on November 5th, with 11,000 foot and 4,000 horse.
Alterol. Powerful targeted pain relief for a faster recovery. The biggest driver of economic growth can't just be found on the stock market.
It's found in me. My lifetime, I will create hundreds of jobs.
Design the smartest city.
Develop a cure for antibiotic resistance.
3D print a house for my land.
Our government changes everything. We're investing in skills and training programs across the UK because growing our business and the economy
Starts with growing me.
make opportunity happen.
And horse. Many English nobles announced their support for William, swelling the prince's ranks. The King of England fielded around 24,000 troops that marched to Salisbury to confront the invaders. However, James proved to be his own worst enemy, as following news of mutiny and defection in his own ranks, he lost his nerve and elected to withdraw to Reading. This meekness provoked more defections, including high-ranking men, the most prominent of which was John Churchill, the future 1st Duke of Marlborough, and the Duke of Grafton. With his confidence spent, James ultimately fled to France and was subsequently deemed to have abdicated the throne. William triumphantly entered London on the 18th of December, and on 11th of April 1689, he was crowned King William III, alongside his own wife Mary, both crowned as co-monarchs. In around just 6 weeks, William had effectively conquered England, and without any military action. However, James, despite his ignominious flight, was not quite ready to give up the fight. With fiscal support from King Louis XIV, who also loaned him 6,000 French troops, James made his way across the Channel. The venue for the showdown, however, would not be England, but Ireland. Many of the majority Catholic Irish recognized James as the legitimate English monarch, and in return he promised religious freedom to the Irish, nullified the confiscation of land from Irish leaders, which had occurred in the 1640s, and favored their cause over the issue of parliamentary autonomy. The tide in Ireland began to shift towards the Catholic majority. James's man in Ireland, Earl of Tyrconnell, had been quietly recruiting Catholics into his army. Pockets of resistance existed, mostly concentrated in the north. Eastern Ulster had been secured with the victory at Dromore on the 14th of March, thus pushing the Protestants west. Meanwhile, James himself had landed in Ireland on the 12th of March with French troops, as well as English, Scots, and Irish volunteers. Back north, the almost exclusively Protestant people of Derry had refused a replacement Jacobite garrison on the 7th of December 1688, and when James himself was fired upon on the 18th of April 1689, the 105-day siege commenced. However, despite much time, blood, and toil, the defenders held out, with Williamite vessels breaking the boom across the River Foyle on the July 28th and relieving the city. On the 31st of July, the Jacobites conceded defeat and withdrew. Back in England, King William felt his position in his newly won kingdom was secure enough to commit to Ireland. He selected the 75-year-old Duke of Schomberg to lead the expeditionary army west. The idea was simply to engage and defeat the Jacobites in a decisive engagement. Schomberg's army landed in Bangor Bay on the 13th of August and forced the surrender of Carrickfergus on the 27th after a week-long siege. With the loss of Ulster, James balked at the advice of French councillors to withdraw west. With the way to Dublin open, he instead elected to prevent its fall. His main force thus moved near to Drogheda, and the Duke of Berwick was ordered to harass Schomberg's advance. Berwick's efforts perhaps did more damage than was usual in such circumstances. Having impeded Schomberg's advance through a concerted program of destruction, this, as well as the worsening weather conditions, took a significant toll on the Williamite forces. Schomberg halted near to Dundalk, and soon disease did what the Jacobites had not in reducing the ranks of the Williamite army. An epidemic of camp fever, reducing Schomberg's ranks by nearly a third. Meanwhile, near Drogheda, James was in an aggressive mood. Wishing to press Schomberg, he ordered his army to within a cannon shot of Schomberg's defences. Days passed with much staring and saber rattling. Seeing that his challenge was not accepted, James grew in confidence. Eventually, however, it was the Jacobite forces that withdrew. Though morale was bolstered in the largely green Jacobite ranks at Schomberg's unwillingness to engage them. The refusal of battle at Dundalk nudged James and many of his army at Dublin into jubilant overconfidence. Meanwhile, Parliament in England began to question the prosecution of the war, particularly the supply of the suffering men. And so William, desiring to end the conflict quickly, resolved to take command personally. With an army comprising 15,000 soldiers, as well as siege guns, ammunition, and a war chest of £200,000 in silver, King William set sail from Hoylake, near Liverpool, on the 11th of June, 1690. In Ireland, Schomberg took the initiative in forcing the Jacobite surrender of Charlemont. King William landed at Carrickfergus. Surmising correctly that James would not allow him to seize Dublin unfought, he made its capture his objective. On the 22nd of June at Dundalk, forward units of both armies clashed, and though the Williamites came off worse, James ordered a withdrawal back south to Drogheda, intending to use the River Boyne as a shield against the advancing enemy. Early on Monday, the 30th of June, the first of William's troops arrived on the high ground overlooking the Boyne, the king arriving soon after. Deciding to probe the Jacobite positions, William sent parties to the bridge of Slane and also Old Bridge, his men suffering under small arms and artillery fire. What happened next was both bizarre and almost decisive. Apparently unsatisfied with this reconnaissance, William himself mounted his horse with several staff and rode to the ford of Old Bridge, and then, perhaps to the astonishment of the Jacobites watching, he halted for a picnic. Unwilling to let such an opportunity slip by, a group of Jacobite horsemen, possibly including Tyrconnell and the Duke of Berwick, rode down to the river parallel to William, and positioning two small cannons took their shot as the king's party mounted to depart. The first shot killed a man and several horses, but it was the second that struck true. Ricocheting off the ground, it struck King William in the shoulder. News quickly spread through both armies that William had fallen. News of the event even rapidly made its way to Paris, where jubilant crowds burnt effigies of the king, and the Bastille fired a feu de joie in celebration. Cheers and relief also spread through the Williamite ranks. However, as far from being dead, William, having had his wound dressed, made a point of riding openly through the camp, accompanied by Frederick Schomberg. A battle would be fought, after all.
Katie and Anna weren't finding signs in the stars by accident. It was no coincidence that their astronomy guide was keen to chat astrology. Such a Sagittarius. And Faith didn't have them hike into the edge of the earth from their hotel steps. Anna did, when she booked a stargazing tour on Get Your Guide. Book forward to it.
Two names, born from a fascination with speed. One measured it, the other mastered it. More than a century later, their stories meet again. Breitling and Aston Martin, time and speed reunited.
Roll. On the eve of battle, William heard rival plans of attack, some advising him to redeploy to an area that would be easier to cross, while the more aggressive among them were all for forcing a crossing at Old Bridge. William, however, settled on his own plan. Deducing that he had numerical superiority, the Count of Schomberg would cross at Slane with the right wing, while his father, the Duke, would attack at Old Bridge with the main body. The king himself would lead the left wing to cross at a point just below Yellow Island. As the first rays of sun lighted the morning, the Count of Schomberg had already begun to march his 7,000 men towards the bridge at Slane. But when informed of its damage, redirected towards Rossneri. There his forward cavalry was met with the withering fire of Jacobite dragoons under Tyrconnell's nephew, Niall O'Neill. Though initially successful, as the Williamite infantry and guns lumbered into view, the weight of fire cleared the way, and the Count's wing began crossing the Boyne. At the Hill of Donore, James and his own war council were far more pessimistic of their chances. Initially having decided on withdrawal towards Dublin, the Jacobite plans were quickly revised as their fears of a flanking manoeuvre materialized. It was at this point that James made the fateful decision to square up against William at the Boyne. Mistaking the Count of Schomberg's flanking force for the whole Williamite army, James had some 2/3 of his force march to intercept. At Old Bridge, James had left the remainder of his army under Tyrconnell, Berwick, and Hamilton, a force of around 8,000 foot and horse, to take on some 24,000 Williamites. A brutal barrage of Williamite artillery battered the Jacobites for an hour, before it was followed by the terrifying sight of Dutch Blue Guards inching across the Boyne. Advancing in formation, the bodies of the guards formed a human dam, raising the water level up to their chests. This necessitated them raising their muskets and satchels above their heads. As the first line clambered onto the south bank, Jacobite fire tore through them. Though checking this initial line of attackers, the subsequent lines of Dutch infantry overwhelmed the Jacobite line in a furious and foggy melee. Meanwhile, the Huguenot Brigade began crossing the Boyne at Grove Island, shortly followed by the Anglo-Dutch Brigade to the east. Though the Earl of Antrim's regiment of foot did march to counter the former, their long-range fire was ineffective, while other regiments point-blank refused to engage. With Williamite numbers inexorably increasing, the situation had reached breaking point for the Jacobites. The dogged Dutch guards were now supported by fresh Huguenot units, and 4 more battalions from the Williamite centre were now poised to cross in support of the spearhead at Oldbridge. Compounding the danger, the Danish brigade further along began crossing via Yellow Island. With the buckling of the Jacobites to their left and facing such frightful odds, Antrim's regiment also withdrew. As the Jacobite infantry was shattered, the Earl of Tyrconnell ordered a cavalry charge of some 1,000 Irishmen. If they could drive the Black Guards back into the river, they may have a chance. Across the Boyne, King William could spy the wave of hooves bearing down on his guard, muttering, "My poor guards, my poor guards." Yet, as the Jacobite horse engaged under the Duke of Berwick, the disciplined Blue Guard met them with musket shot and a bayonet, and the Jacobite cavalry swarming around them. Richard Hamilton had tried to organize a countercharge of the Irish infantry. However, most were raw recruits, unaccustomed to and unwilling to engage in the bloody melee that would ensue. Instead, Hamilton attached himself to the cavalry being organized to charge by Tyrconnell. The Life Guards, as well as Tyrconnell's own regiment and also Parker's regiment under Hamilton's command, thundered back into the emerging ranks of the Williamites. Meanwhile, the old Duke of Schomberg led his own brave charge into the hellscape, leading his cavalry to his own death. The 75-year-old was slashed in the head with a sword before supposedly being shot in the neck. At Yellow Island, both Jacobite dragoon regiments successfully checked the advance of the Danes, some of whom had gained a slim beachhead. However, upon withdrawing slightly to reform and continue pressing the attack, Lord Dongan fell, and with this shock in morale, both units withdrew hastily south. As for King William, he was not idle that day. Upon seeing his army cutting their way across at Oldbridge, he elected to lead his own cavalry force downstream via Drybridge. This crossing was deeper, with man and horse struggling to make the crossing. So that on touching the south bank, William, still much affected by the injury from the cannon shot to his shoulder, collapsed to the ground for a few minutes to catch his breath. With William's crossing of the Boyne with large numbers of cavalry, the game was up. The Jacobites had managed to pin down the Williamite infantry due to their lack of cavalry, but with this advantage lost, a general Jacobite withdrawal south ensued. King William himself led his cavalry to harass the retreating Jacobites, but was met with stiff resistance at both Dunor Graveyard and then Platten Hall. Indeed, at the former, the fighting was confused enough that the king himself narrowly avoided death by pistol shot at the hands of one of his own men. Even if tragedy had struck, however, the overall momentum of battle was incontrovertibly with the Williamite forces. Some 3 miles west, King James had sat idle, glaring at the inactive Count of Schomberg's wing, which had stalled before some marshy ground below his position. As news reached him of the disaster at Old Bridge, James considered taking the fight to the younger Schomberg, but on advice from his scouts, he thought better of it. When he also spied some of Meinhardt's units begin to move south, as if to cut off any line retreat to Dublin, James's nerve once more cracked, and he ordered a general withdrawal. William did not press the fleeing James because, among other reasons, his main body was still reorganizing and resting after the fight on the south bank, and the Jacobite garrison still held Drogheda to their rear. By day's end, the field belonged to the Williamites. The effect was not an immediate collapse of Jacobite resistance by any means, but the outcome did shatter James's own resolve to fight on. He fled to Dublin, where he reportedly lay the blame for the defeat at the feet of his Irish soldiers. As for the bulk of James's army, many grumbled that he had thrown victory aside through his poor judgment in unwittingly moving the troops away from the main theatre of battle. Indeed, the majority of the Jacobites that day never unsheathed their swords or fired a shot. As for James himself, he sailed for France on the 4th of July and later died there in 1701. Despite the victory, the Battle of the Boyne did not immediately result in Williamite victory in Ireland. Indeed, 2 sieges of Athlone and Limerick, respectively, in the following weeks, were unsuccessful, and it would not be until the decisive Battle of Aughrim over a year later that Jacobite hopes were finally extinguished. The Treaty of Limerick ended the conflict later in October. As for William himself, he would reign jointly and then alone as King of England, Ireland, and Scotland until his own death in 1702. He remains a polarizing figure in Ireland to this day. If you stayed around this far, thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment as a sacrifice to the algorithm. You can also support us on Patreon and get ad-free early access to our videos for as little as $1, or by clicking the thanks button below to leave a one-time tip. As always, we'll see you in the next one.
Please, Hines.
That it does, dear. That it does.
Because I'm worth it.
You are. Love.
Hater.
Love it.
When you need low prices on brands you love, every little helps.
Come check into Hotel Luxstyle with me. Understated elegance. It's quiet luxury.
It is August 12th, 1704, and in the Bavarian countryside near Donauwörth and Hochstadt, one of 40 French cavalry patrol squadrons, led by the Marquis de Sealy, has encountered a small work detachment from the confederated armies of John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, and the commander of Austrian imperial forces, Prince Eugene of Savoy. After a quick exchange of fire with the detail's armed escort, Dasili captures 4 of the laborers who had been working to level a riverbank and enable a crossing over one of the Danube tributaries that lie between the Franco-Bavarian army and the Allied Confederates on the opposite side. He puts them under separate interrogation, and they each inform their captors that Marlborough and Savoy intend to withdraw their forces in the face of the superior French position and its numerical advantage, and retreat north to the town of Nordlingen. This is much to the satisfaction and expectation of the French High Commander, the Duke de Tallard. Commanding as he does the plain north of the town of Hochstadt, with his Bavarian allies in command of the heights around Lutzingen, as well as the village of Blenheim on the nearby Danube to his right, not to mention the tributaries of the Kessel, Reichen and Nebel, creating numerous hindrances to any advance from the British and their allies. Tallard and the common military thinking of the time is of the firm opinion that he has outmaneuvered Marlborough. The long British march from the Netherlands that so long confounded the French has all been for naught. Spirits in the French and Bavarian camps the night after Dasili's patrol are at a high. There is much wine and dancing, high fires and great late summer carousing. With the withdrawal of the British, these 50,000 Frenchmen and their German allies will soon march to winter quarters, the majority seeing little fighting for a half a year at least. While for the High Command, the road to Vienna and the removal of Austria from the War of Spanish Succession will bring what for them is its inevitable conclusion. Victory for the Sun King, Louis XIV. Spain and France will be united under the Bourbon monarchs, and Louis's long reign will be crowned with its greatest achievement. Would you like to rewrite history, command legends, build your empire? With our sponsor, Heroes of History, the past and future collide in a thrilling blend of city building, strategy, and real-time combat. Lead your civilization from humble beginnings to unstoppable greatness by building your empire through research, conquest, and strategy. Win epic battles by collecting legendary heroes such as Napoleon, Alexander the Great, Caesar, and a vast array of other heroes to choose from, each with their own unique abilities. Assemble unstoppable battle lineups and challenge rivals or team up with allies in competitive and cooperative gameplay. Success in battle depends on using the right heroes at the right time, and you train heroes in the barracks alongside your units. In my playthrough, I most enjoyed the city building because it's all about strategic optimization. Different buildings and upgrades help build a thriving economy, a powerful army, and unstoppable heroes. With a time travel storyline, stunning eras to explore, and regular live events, every session offers new ways to expand your power. Whether you play for minutes or hours, play anytime, anywhere, on mobile or browser, and leave your mark on history. Heroes of History is one of those well-made games. It's hilariously fun to play, and it's completely free, so try it out today. Download now using my link below, or scan the QR code on screen. Use the promo code STARTNOW to get a great boost to unlock your first legendary hero. Thanks again to Heroes of History for sponsoring today's video. While France becomes the unquestioned dominant power of Europe, England will return to its isolation across the Channel, its dreams of continental influence at an end. The embryonic state of Prussia will prove easy work for Louis in the aftermath. The French army goes to sleep that night in restful, untroubled ease. The next morning, Tallard dispatches a message to Louis telling him that the enemy assembled at 3 o'clock and were presently drawn before their camp. It looks as if they will march this day, he writes to the monarch. Rumor in the countryside expects them in Nordlingen. Marlborough, Savoy, and the imperial forces under Louis William of Baden will be unable to maintain their bases in Bavaria in consequence, and their war effort will enter a state of collapse. The memo sent, Tallard goes to breakfast. A short time later, Jean-Philippe Eugene, Count of Mirod-Westerloo, is awakened by his valet in the barn he has requisitioned, close to the village of Blenheim. The enemy are here, the terrified servant tells the Count, but his frantic manner elicits only amusement and ribbing from the aristocrat. Finally rising from his bed and going to the door, Westerloo looks out and rubs his eyes in disbelief. The entire sunlit plain appears to him covered in enemy squadrons. In a state of shock, he accepts a cup of hot chocolate from his valet, but then common sense displaces bewilderment, and the Count rides at full tilt for the main French camp. He finds Tallard riding in the opposite direction. No sooner had the Duke sent the soothing letter to Louis than the enemy squadrons and battalions began to appear like red phantoms on the high ground in front of him. While Tallard goes to ascertain the true nature of Marlborough and Savoy's deployment, Westerloo continues to the French camp and is horrified to find the greater part of it still in bed. Once again, Marlborough has wrong-footed the French, doing precisely what they least suspect. And now there will be a contest between fully 100,000 men on both sides, in which the French have the superiority in numbers and guns, but the Allies have already won the initiative. Though many of them do not yet realize it, the coming battle will decide the fate of a continent on the cusp of world domination, and whether the greater part of the world's peoples will be ruled by English parliamentaries or French absolutists. But nobody on the field that morning has any doubt that the cost of victory this day will be blood, given dearly by victor and vanquished alike. At the outset of the 1704 campaigning season, French forces are without doubt on the front foot in the War of the Spanish Succession. No fewer than 5 French armies are operational in various theatres, ranging from the Duc de Villeroi's army in the Spanish Netherlands, through the Comte de Coigny's force in Alsace, and the Duc de Vendôme's army in northern Italy. Most dangerously of all, Ferdinand, the Comte de Marsan, had joined his force with that of Maximilian of Bavaria, and together they are moving east, with the capture of Vienna as their objective. They are supported in the rear by the Duc de Tallard's strong force at Strasbourg, which stands ready with reinforcements should there arise a need. The Austrian imperial court is potentially fatally compromised by an anti-Habsburg Hungarian rising, led by the Prince of Transylvania, Francis II Rákóczi, which is not only growing in strength to a full-fledged war of independence, but is also drawing the attention of the Ottoman Sultanate, which suspects it might have an opportunity to reverse 3 decades of Habsburg advances in the present turmoil. Against this grand front, the Grand Alliance of Britain, the United Provinces, and the Austrian Empire can muster 3 main forces. The mostly Dutch and British army under the command of John Churchill, the Duke Marlborough in the Netherlands, the army of Louis William, the Margrave of Baden on the lines of Stolhofen, and the force of Eugene of Savoy, which is positioned nearby at Ulm. As the spring of 1704 proceeds, Marlborough becomes acutely aware that the loss of Vienna will effectively end the war in France's favour, and he begins to make plans for a brazen manoeuvre. He informs the Dutch government of the United Provinces that he will march his forces to the Moselle, a tributary of the Rhine, in the hope of easing some of the pressure on the hard-pressed Habsburg forces, and perhaps also find a way to bring the fight into France itself. Leaving the Count of Nassau in the Netherlands with a force for its protection in the event Villeroy makes an incursion, Marlborough moves south, threatening to cross the Rhine, and even having diversionary pontoon bridges deployed, and utilizing other sleight-of-hand tactics.
Today we're not going to be funny.
No change there then.
Saving for your first home can feel almost impossible.
And the road to Arnhem can be a bumpy one.
That's why Santander have first-time buyer mortgages with deposits starting from just £10,000, even on larger loans.
It's more than running. It's the comeback after the setback. It's more than powerful targeted pain relief. It's helping you to keep moving. Voltarol, it's more than running. Tactics. Moving at a swift pace of 80 miles a day, assisted by the Dutch, who provide barges to ship men and supplies down the Rhine, as well as arranging to have depots and camping grounds ready in the various rest stops ahead of time, Marlborough's march is a marvel of military organization. Just over a week following his departure on the 19th of May, he is reinforced with thousands of German soldiers from the states of Hanover and Prussia, bringing his combined forces up to 40,000 well-conditioned and amply supplied professional servicemen. Such is the sudden change and surge in forces that Marlborough has concocted with his march, the very war itself begins to follow him. Tallard has already moved through the Black Forest, starting on the 14th of May, arriving on the 18th to link up with the now detached Marsanne, while Villeroy has begun moving south and trailing Marlborough, taking pressure from the previously threatened Dutch. When Marlborough crosses the Main on the 3rd of June, the French are convinced that he has resolved on a thrust west in the direction of Landau, which had already fallen once and had to be recaptured in a second, month-long siege the following year. Thus vindicated in his plan and feeling that he was not doing his allies a disservice, Marlborough moves away from the Rhine and Moselle at the end of the first week in June, crossing the river Neckar on the 7th, and on the 10th, he and Savoy meet and confer at Mundelsheim, and are joined 3 days later by the Margrave of Baden. The two men are already admirers of one another's work, and the partnership between Marlborough and Savoy, as well as the cooperation of the Margrave, gives the Allies an edge lacking in the Franco-Bavarian leadership. Now leading a very formidable force, which when combined could overwhelm any of the French armies on a given day, they have a number of options. It is decided that Savoy will ride with almost 30,000 men west in an effort to hold Tallard and Villeroy from joining with Marsanne and Maximilian's forces. Marlborough and the Margrave will continue into Bavaria and attempt to force Maximilian from his alliance with the French in one way or another. Tallard meets with Villeroy on the same day, the 13th of June, at Landau to discuss possible reactions to Marlborough's next move, and also how to regain the initiative of the war, as well as seek permission from Louis to alter the war plans due to Marlborough's maneuvers. Back in Bavaria and unsure how to proceed, Marsanne and Maximilian have retreated and dug in at Dillingen, which, while still in Swabia, was located on the Danube, another clear indicator of how Marlborough had, in the words of his descendant, Prime Minister Winston Churchill, dragged the whole war with him. Louis gives permission for Tallard to join his forces to those of Marsanne and Maximilian of Bavaria on the 27th of June, and Tallard begins his second crossing of the Black Forest on the 1st of July. Savoy is presented with a dilemma by Tallard's action. On the one hand, his mission is to block any crossing from eastern France by the commanders there, but on the other, Villeroy is still in place with a considerable retinue. Should Savoy follow Tallard, there will be nothing to stop Villeroy walking across the border and gaining a favorable position on the Allies from any direction. Savoy does not prevaricate, but he does split his army, leaving 12,000 men in position on the defensive line between Bull and Stolhofen, and then shadows Talard's almost 40,000 strong force with the remainder. The laboured and reactive nature of the French campaign came into stark clarity the day after Tallard marches, when the combined Allied army begins an attack on Schellenberg. It is a bloody affair, costing 10,000 lives on both sides. But Marlborough and the Margrave take the fortress, and with it a route into Bavaria and the Danube. Losing many of his finest troops in this battle, Maximilian and the French troops under Marsan fall back to Augsburg and there await Tallard. Unable to lure them into battle, Marlborough sets his army loose on the Bavarian countryside, indulging in weeks of devastation and rapine. His reasoning for the destruction and pillage is simple. If he cannot destroy Maximilian in a battle, then he will obliterate Bavaria's utility to the French as an ally and source of supply. As it is, the ransacking does not halt Tallard from crossing the Black Forest, Savoy being unable to get to grips with the much larger French force, and Tallard links his forces with those of Maximilian and Marsan at Augsburg on the 5th of August. Savoy settles his army at Hochstadt the same day. Marlborough's army is at Rhine, but he, Savoy, and the Margrave are able to meet in person that night without difficulty at Schrobenhausen, fewer than 30 miles from the French and Bavarian armies. Despite holding 2 crossings over the Danube, they decide that the Margrave will march to take Ingolstadt with 15,000 on the 7th of August. The French and Bavarian commanders, no doubt aware of these maneuvers, begin to hold their own conferences on strategy. Tallard, whose army has not travelled nearly as well as Marlborough's, is in support of waiting for the now disparate Allied forces to wear themselves out and make their inevitable withdrawal. Marsan and Maximilian, in contrast, wish to make the most of the numerical advantage they hold over the Allies and attack Eugene of Savoy at Hochstadt. Tallard accedes to the request. Maximilian is no doubt eager to make some kind of statement in the wake of the spoliation of Bavaria, and on the 9th of August, the Franco-Bavarian army starts over the Danube toward Hochstadt.
Very dry, tight, sensitive skin. Relieve it in 60 seconds with Aveeno Skin Relief. Enriched with soothing triple oat complex, clinically proven to help restore skin's moisture barrier and intensely hydrate your skin for 72 hours. Aveeno.
Cat food. Arriving today with Amazon Prime. That's off your mind. So now you can worry about something else like... Can Xavier read minds?
Hochstadt. Savoy and Marlborough have been in constant communication ever since Marlborough began his march from the Netherlands, and Savoy wastes no time in contacting him when the French operation reveals itself. It is almost certain the whole army is crossing the Danube at Lauingen, he writes. I have held on here all day, but I dare not risk staying the night. Telling Marlborough that they are now at risk of being caught between the mountains and the river, and with their supply lines through Nordlingen under threat of attack, Savoy moves from Hochstadt to the village of Münster, just southwest of Donauwörth. Marlborough is a similar distance of about 7 miles on the other side of the town, and he joins his forces with those of Savoy by the 11th. The Franco-Bavarians, meanwhile, have occupied Hochstadt, and then, encouraged once more by Maximilian and Marsan, Tallard spreads his forces on a 3-mile front. From the town the British called Blenheim by the bank of the Danube on the right wing and opposite the village of Tapfheim, to Oberglau in the centre, and finally Lutzingen on the left. With the Nabil tributary providing a marshy covering area, Tallard is satisfied that the outnumbered and strategically disadvantaged Marlborough and Savoy will not attempt an attack, while at the same time he is assuaging his ally Maximilian by maneuvering aggressively toward the enemy. The Allied army has scouts reconnoiter the area after their arrival at Munster, and on the evening before the battle, Marlborough and Savoy ride together and observe the French positions. Marlborough is confident that the army can cross the streams, riverbeds, and marsh to engage in a meaningful attack, and Savoy is characteristically confident. The two men conspire that night, and the next morning at 2 o'clock, the Allied army rises for its habitual early start to the day. Marlborough commands the Allied centre, while Lieutenant General John Cutts takes command of the Allied left wing. Savoy will command the right wing. In all, the Allies are commanding a force of nearly 180 squadrons of cavalry, 66 battalions of infantry, and 66 artillery guns. Against this, Tallard's forces are 143 squadrons of cavalry, 70 battalions of infantry, and 90 guns, making for a very formidable defensive position. Tallard's decision not to occupy the village of Tapfheim, which was situated in a tight space between the Danube and the forested hills to the north, means that the Allies have a smooth deployment, but he was clearly concerned with keeping his force behind the protective screen of the Nabil. This same plain of Hochstadt has seen a battle between Franco-Bavarian forces against an Imperial and Prussian army just under a year before, and the Prussian Major General Knutzmer accompanies Marlborough as his army takes its place around the Nabil. He will not only forewarn the Lord about the possibility of a bottleneck situation around Tapfheim on his advance into the plain, but also in regard to the difficulty he would face should his army face a rout and need to withdraw. Marlborough is gambling heavily with his army, and many of his officers have private concerns regarding the wisdom of their leader's battle plan. In the event, they largely keep these to themselves, even as Lieutenant General Cutts and his men endure fire from guns stationed near Blenheim village, while they wait for the order to attack. Having taken 2 mills easily while the enemy camp still slept, Cutts is forced to halt his men and await the order from his commander to move forward. Marlborough, for his part, is waiting on word that Savoy was in place to launch his attack simultaneously from the Allied right wing. Those same British officers who were astounded to see French and German troops watching them from in front of their still-standing tents as they took up position now had to watch themselves as the element of surprise they enjoyed seemed to have been lost with the delay. All along the miles of front line, thousands of English, Irish, Scottish, Welsh, Dutch, Danish, Prussian and Hanoverian soldiers wait while the Duke of Saxony picks his way with difficulty down the route of the Nabil to the far right wing. Though the French have literally been caught napping, their guns open fire on the Allied line as early as 8:30, and from that time until 1 p.m, Marlborough's army has to endure the bombardment, while their fewer guns try to make a reply. The French and Bavarian rank and file take position, and their artillery keeps a steady rhythm as their leadership meets in Blenheim village and confers on the morning's developments. Tallard, Maximilian and Marsan choose the tower of the village church as their venue, the better to observe the plain beyond and gain a better insight into Marlborough and Savoy's strategy. Unlike the Allied forces, however, the Franco-Bavarian commanders plan with barely concealed animosity for one another. Maximilian, suspecting correctly that Marlborough intends to attack with his main force through the centre, urges Tallard to move his squadrons and battalions as close to the line of the Nabil Marsh as possible, and thence cut down the Allied forces while they are moving slowly. Tallard, unwilling to listen to what he thinks are orders from the Elector, retorts that he will allow the British to pass over the marsh, thereby giving himself a greater number to kill when they are in the open. Maximilian presses the point and insists that once the British are across the marsh, Tallard will struggle to repel them, but Tallard refuses to concede, and the conference ends with both Marsan and Maximilian disgruntled. Tallard does have a plan, and with his advantage in numbers, heavy guns and position, he has good reason too to be confident. While Marsan and Maximilian take up the left flank of the army from the village of Oberglau to Lutzingen, Tallard himself commands the centre with a very strong host. With the ground in this section flat and open, Tallard puts all of his cavalry squadrons in place, even taking some 30 squadrons from Marsan and giving some infantry in return. Keeping them back from the marsh area has the added benefit of keeping them out of range of Marlborough's guns. The infantry is intended to prevent a flanking operation of the cavalry when Tallard gives the order to charge. He sends 28 infantry battalions to Blenheim, along with 12 squadrons of dragoons, who will dismount and take up defensive firing positions prior to the battle. The former are commanded by the Marquis of Clermont-Beau, while the latter are under orders from Count Gabriel d'Hautefeuille. Once Marlborough's troops have passed the marsh, these units stationed in Blenheim are to make an attack on the Allied flank, while at the same time, Tallard would order a full cavalry charge from the front. With the infantry from Blenheim and the marsh cutting off escape, Tallard's intention is to steamroller Marlborough's smaller force and vaporize them on the plain. It is a sound plan, but Marsan and Maximilian seem to be unaware of it, as they draw their own forces on the left up close to the marsh as they had encouraged Tallard to do. And there is a disconnect between the two armies that likely does not escape the notice of Marlborough. On his side, despite the unity with Savoy remaining solid, the British commander begins to become apprehensive once the allotted time of 10 o'clock passes and Savoy is still not in position. The waiting in range of artillery is having its effect on both armies. Katz's column in front of Blenheim is lying in the grass to try and gain some respite from the unending barrage. Under heavy fire, their engineers try to fashion some walkways across the waterlogged ground, using the timber of the two mills they captured on their arrival. The Allied guns are having their effect on the French side also, still trying to bring his units into line and communicate effectively with his superiors. Merode Westerloo reports that one cannon shot takes off the head of his horse and kills two troopers behind him less than a second later. Another of his reserve mounts is killed while being held for him, and a third is hit while he is in the saddle, killing the animal and ripping off a piece of flesh as large as the crown of a hat. Unfortunately for every man present on the Hochstadt plain that hot August day, this violence is but the prelude. At 12:30, Savoy sends word to Marlborough that he has finally managed the feat of moving his 74 cavalry squadrons and 18 battalions of mixed Danish and Prussian infantry into place in front of Maximilian and Marsan's army on the right of the Allied army. Marlborough receives this with satisfaction and relays approval for an advance to Katz. Katz orders the first of his 4 infantry brigades under the command of Archibald Rowe to proceed with an attack on Blenheim. Shortly thereafter, between 1 and 1:30, Savoy begins the advance on his side. Marlborough's plan begins in earnest. Just as he has spent the preceding months relying on misdirection to gain the advantage and force the enemy to react to his unpredictable moves, so his strategy in this decisive confrontation will entail forcing the French to put their focus in the wrong place. But it will require supreme bravery and discipline on the parts of both Savoy, Cutts, and the men under their command. As the two wings advance over hundreds of meters of arduous and treacherous ground, all the while fired on by French artillery, their task, Cutts in particular, is to make it appear that this is the main focus of the Allied advance. Just as he had drawn Villeroy from pressuring the Netherlands to follow him along the Rhine, so Marlborough needs Tallard and the others to be convinced that the wings are where they need to place their strongest troops. Rowe's assault on Blenheim is a noble failure, Rowe himself being killed along with many of his men in a French dragoon volley just as he reaches their palisade, armed only with a sword. On the right wing, Savoy crosses the Navel with a mixed company of infantry and cavalry, and his horsemen manage to scatter a Franco-Bavarian cavalry force, but the second line of French cavalry halts the advance and sends him back across the river. His infantry continues to move forward, but Bavarian musketeers drive back the Prussians, and left completely in the open and alone, Savoy's Danes must follow suit. With Savoy's whole force now back on the far side of the Navel, the sides engage in a short standoff. On the left flank in Blenheim village, the remainder of Rowe's brigade are pursued in retreat by elite French gendarmes, who mete out hard retribution on them, but they are themselves caught from the side by a brigade of Hessians, commanded by Lieutenant General John Wilkes. The gendarmes are forced into a retreat of their own, allowing Rowe's brigade respite to reform, while the Hessians move after the quickly departing French. At the same time, another of Cutts' brigades, this time Scots led by James Ferguson, have begun another advance on the village. The infantry and dragoons defending it are now under pressure. On the right wing, Savoy has had enough rest, and he orders another charge on Marsan and Maximilian's positions, and when that fails, he orders a third, each time riding and then marching with his men into the very mouth of the French and Bavarian fire. This peerless, astounding sacrifice and bravery by the wings of the Allied army brings its reward, as the commander of the French infantry in Blenheim, Clérambault, seeing that the unrelenting Allied forces are enjoying greater success and the elite gendarmes are in retreat, orders that the French reserve be brought into the village. Merode-Westerlo sees the error at once, but Clérambault has made the decision without informing or seeking permission from Tallard, and he is powerless to intervene once the extra troops are in place. The tiny village now becomes clogged with 10,000 French soldiers, who are so closely packed that firing their weapons, let alone relaying orders or building formations, is impossible. Marlborough too detects the mistake, and he messages Cutts to avoid any more costly attacks. Instead, he is to maintain pressure and hold those French contingents in place. The numerical advantage of the French in the centre now removed, Marlborough orders the general advance. Tallard had been observing events on his left wing, and he rides back now to see Clérambault's commandeering of the reserves into Blenheim, as well as an attempt by the gendarmes, which had remained harassing Cutts' flank, to scatter the remainder of Rowe's brigade. Seeing the charge, Cutts requests aid from General Henry Lumley's cavalry that is acting as a link between Marlborough's main force of British, Dutch, and German forces and Cutts' column. Lumley dispatches Colonel Palmer with 3 cavalry, Colonel Cyborg in support with 2 more. To the general disbelief of the French and the Bavarians, the British charge breaks that of the gendarmes and continues on towards Blenheim, where it is forced to withdraw by the defenders. The British cavalry tactic of charging into the enemy at full gallop with sabres proves its superiority over the French method of pausing to fire pistols before executing close hand fighting. Tallard, now seeing real danger for the first time, rides to Marsan and Maximilian while Marlborough's main force is crossing the Nebel and the surrounding marsh, and he requests additional troops in the centre. While he is there, Clérambault takes even more reserves out of the central French line and moves them into Blenheim. Tallard's high-handedness with his fellow commanders that morning now comes back to haunt him, as both the Elector of Bavaria and General Marsan tell him that they can offer no help, being as they are preoccupied with Savoy's continued attacks on their flank, as well as the danger posed by Marlborough's coming advance to their own lines. The main battle in the central village of Oberglau begins when 10 Dutch battalions, as well as a number of the 22 Danish cavalry squadrons, move into it, but they are forced to withdraw by elements of Marsan's infantry. First the Danes after they cross the Nebel, and then the Dutch when they come into range of the village. The defenders here are a mixture of French battalions, as well as the Irish Wild Geese, the Catholic army that had taken service with the French in the wake of the Williamite War in 1691. Marlborough himself arrives in the wake of the withdrawal, ordering that his artillery commander, Horcroft Blood, direct fire in support of the Dutch. Even still, there is no way to approach the village, and seeing that the initiative is now swinging their way once more, Marsan orders his cavalry to move against the forces converging on Oberglau. For a moment that perhaps seems ominously long to Marlborough, the matter hangs in the balance. As a last throw of the dice, he requests that Savoy release the cuirassiers on his left to lend support to the Oberglau attack. Savoy immediately releases the cuirassiers for Marlborough's use, displaying the chivalry for which he was famed, and in stark contrast to the bad working relationship between Tallard and his fellow generals. Swinging around, they charge Marsan's cavalry, effectively flanking them as they flank Marlborough's force, and the French are driven back. As a result of this and Savoy's continued attacks on the right, the French and Irish are confined to Oberglau and cannot stop Marlborough from bringing the rest of his forces over the Nebel and onto the plain. Over the next hour, while the French and Bavarians engage in some desultory attacks, Marlborough and his brother Charles are able to form up a force of 7 frontline infantry battalions, with 2 lines comprising no fewer than 72 cavalry squadrons behind that, and then another 11 battalions of infantry in the rear. He also allows time for Blood to coordinate the sights of his guns, as well as Savoy to gather and muster his remaining units. Against this force, Tallard can only muster 64 squadrons of cavalry and 9 battalions of infantry. Worse is that these infantry battalions are novices in comparison to Marlborough's hardened veterans. When the advance resumes at 5 o'clock, the combination of infantry support by cavalry moving forward with the cover of Blood's guns proves irresistible. Tallard attempts to fall back on the flanking attack from Blenheim village as he originally planned, but Clérambault appears to have lost his reason and resists forcefully any attempt to requisition men from the village. Westerlo tries to bring 12 unused battalions out of the village to aid the centre, but Clérambault violently seizes them back and refuses to allow them to join the battle. At the critical moment before contact, while the entire Allied line from Blenheim to Lutzingen is moving forward, Marlborough orders his second-line cavalry, still fresh despite the lateness of the day, to charge. Seeing this ferocious assault, the now exhausted gendarmes and French infantry begin to fall back, first in small numbers, and then in greater and larger groups. Just as the British cavalry tactics asserted primacy over those of the gendarmes, the British infantry system of platoon firing and use of heavier musket balls wins the day over the French ranking fire system and their smaller balls. Before long, Talard has to watch as his whole army collapses and devolves into a rabble, scrambling desperately to save their lives and escape what is quickly turning into a slaughter. He is captured, along with around 14,000 of his men, and while Marsan and Maximilian manage to leave the field with their lives and liberty, Marlborough has achieved a victory that crowns a campaign that will see him titled England's greatest military commander. French losses in terms of casualties, dead and wounded, along with those taken prisoner, are staggeringly close to 30,000. The supremacy of Louis XIV's military is unalterably broken, though France's innate strength is such that the war will last for another decade. But when it is brought to a close, Britain will have taken its place as the premier European and subsequently global power for the next 2 centuries. If you like what you see, consider supporting my work.
Serious gamers like Robin need ultra.
The bewitching talents of Paris Saint-Germain facing in Bayern Munich the closest thing the European game currently has to a runaway train. Lovely touch, Diaz with a chance. He goes down and it's a penalty kick.
The way they hit tends to the break.